This is Office Talk with Annette Stepanian. Welcome back to another episode of Office Talk. In this week's episode, I am talking to Bruno Bornsztein, who is the founder of Curbly. Now, if you haven't checked out Curbly, it is a website that he created a few years ago, 10 years ago, if you can believe it. And it's for home improvement enthusiasts. So if you like a good IKEA hack or you like a good DIY project, that is what Curbly is all about. Now, I wanted to have Bruno on the show because I saw him speak at Alt Summit a few months ago, and the topic was all about how to monetize your content. Now, if you are a content creator, whether you're a blogger or you create content on the daily, and you want to find out the different ways that others are monetizing their content, after all, you're putting a lot of time and effort into it, you want to figure out how you can make some moolah off of it, then this episode is for you. Not only are we going to talk a little bit about Bruno and his experience starting up a blog to where it is today, but we're going to talk about the current trends in generating revenue off of your content. So with that said, my friend, let's go to the show. Hey, Bruno, thank you so much for being with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So I'm excited to talk to you because I actually had a chance to sit in on your presentation at Alt Summit a few months ago. And I was like, I didn't want to bring him on the show because I thought what you were talking about was super, super helpful. But before we dive in, can you bring your listeners up to speed about who you are, what you do, and all that good stuff?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for sitting in on my Alt Summit talk. That was my first time presenting at Alt, so I was really pleased to get to be there, and I had a lot of fun. So yeah, my name is Bruno Bornsztein, and I run two blogs. One is called Curbly, and the other is called Manmade DIY. So that's curbly.com and manmadediy.com. And I've been doing this for more than 10 years now. Curbly launched in the winter of 2006.
Wow. So, you're like old school.
Yeah, I know.
I just called you old, but I didn't mean that,
yeah,
but you know what I mean.
No, that's fine. Actually, my birthday's coming up, so it's fine.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. So, right, I started Curbly, just to give listeners some context, before Pinterest. I started Curbly when you still needed a .edu account to get a Facebook account. So, blogging really was newer then. You still had to explain to people kind of what it was. So it's just a different context sort of than the world we're in now. So Curbly, right from the beginning, has been about the home. Curbly is really about the space where you live. Our tagline that we kind of use is love where you live. So we really just kind of are about anything related to people making their home beautiful, making it an expression of who they are, who they want to be, what their values are. We really think that, the place where you live reflects the kind of person that you are. And that's a really interesting content space to be in. So that's what Curbly is about. We are sort of a group blog. We're a little bit different than some of the blogs out there in the sense that we don't have a singular author, personality that drives the content. So we work with a lot of contributors. We have 4 full-time employees who also generate a lot of the content. So yeah, Curbly has sort of a multiple personality voice, which is a little bit different than some of the other blogs that are out there.
And what was the inspiration behind starting it? Because like you said, in 2006, it wasn't really mainstream and it wasn't necessarily easy to do it. So what was the inspiration?
It's a little bit funny. So my background is journalism, public relations, and web development. So I'm actually, before I did Curbly, I built websites and web applications for people. And so in 2006, a friend of mine and I had some free time, and we had just done a big contract. So we had a little bit of money saved up. And so we wanted to build something. We didn't really know what. So Curbly kind of came about because I had bought my first house a few years before, and that was really what was on my mind. I mean, I was always, refinishing the woodwork or, shoveling backed up sewage out of the basement or, just all kinds of stuff having to
glamorous.
Yeah, sorry, that's kind of gross. But,
but my friend just had the same problem. She had like a drainage issue. So yeah.
Well, there's a funny and long story on Curbly if you're curious about that episode. Yeah, so, that was just what was in my world at the time. My wife and I we didn't have any money or very much money. And what we would spend our time and our resources on was DIY projects and making our house better and trying to improve things. So that's where Curbly came about. We decided to build a site that was oriented around that. It sort of grew organically from there. I mean, the initial idea wasn't like, let's start a big blog. It just kind of developed into that over time.
And so when did you know that, okay, this is something that's just more than us documenting our experience with bad sewage and drainage issues and DIY projects? When did you realize, there's something to this that I need to really focus on?
That is a really good question. I actually have a blog post in my drafts about this idea, and I'll just address it the way I'm thinking about it in my blog post, which is sometimes at the beginning, failure and success looks the same. And so when you're just starting out, it's really easy to like confuse the two. And so often I think that's why I think your question is so good, is because looking back, it's like, well, when did you actually realize that you were doing something that was working? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So in our case, there were a few things that in retrospect should have been really obvious, but at the time weren't really that obvious. So first of all, we launched Curbly, I think like November 7th, 2006. And by December of that year, we had 50,000 page views a month.
Oh, wow.
So right now you look at that and you're like, oh, well, you must have been doing something right. But at the time we were like, oh no, we're like, it's not working. Like there's not enough people. We don't have enough users. I think in our minds, we thought like we only have 1,000 people who have signed up, to like be members on the site.
Is that because you were comparing yourself to somebody? Like, what was your comparison point?
Right, exactly. Yeah, probably we were like trying to compare ourselves to like Facebook or whoever else was around. Apartment Therapy was around then. But a lot of it just has to do with kind of what I was saying, which is that at the beginning, you don't really have good context for judging whether what you're doing is working. So, it's the answer to that is difficult because it only kind of becomes clear much later on, like with a lot more experience, that it's actually working. So I guess if you had to turn it into a point of like advice for somebody who's starting something new, I would say focus less on those metrics, like how many page views am I getting this month, or, how many users signed up or whatever, and focus more on how passionate do you feel about this project? Because, the one thing was in month 2 and 3 and 4 of Curbly, I was still really, really passionate about it. Like I woke up every morning thinking like, wow, like what am I going to do to make Curbly better today? Like I'm so excited that I get to spend the day doing this. That is a really good indicator that the thing that you're working on is actually succeeding and will eventually succeed. But that's not something that's super obvious when you're just starting out.
Yeah. I loved your point about how failure and success oftentimes look the same, at least initially. Like that's why I was so quiet, because I was like processing what you were saying. It's so true. It makes so much sense. And I do think that, it has to feel good to you. I mean, especially if you're going into something to create your own business. Like part of the reason people do that is because they want to do something that they enjoy, that they have freedom and control over. But I do think there's a point where you want to see progress. And sometimes it's so easy to fall on those metrics, whether it's readers, page views, followers, money, right? It's like some sort of numerical metric that you can refer to and say like, yeah, I'm making progress. But I think to your point, like they kind of have to go hand in hand as well. Like it still has to feel good to you, because you could grow a business and like have the huge numbers, but if you're not excited about it, it's kind of a useless exercise at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously you can't just keep plugging away at something that is meant to be a business endeavor, without ever like making a buck. So that's not what I'm saying, but more the idea that sometimes at the beginning, like when you're just starting out, like you might be in month 2 and like not be making any money. And, if you let yourself get distracted by that or some of these metrics, you could give up, or you could like change course to something totally different. But actually, if you had stuck with it for another month, that might have been your big breakthrough. And it's very hard to know. Like there's just no way, it's not easy to know at the time whether that's the case, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I say, well, at least to some extent, you need to balance that more with, do I really still like believe in the thing that I'm working on? And does it get me, excited to get up and be better?
Yeah. And so much of what we do, like to your point also, is we're so quick to want to see results, and things take time. And sometimes I like to think of it as like you're sowing seeds and you got to nurture them. And, it may not bloom until for a while, but when it does, you start seeing kind of reaping the benefits of it. And it takes time. Things take time.
Yeah. I guess that's true. And I think it's time and experience. And when you've been doing it for a while, you have the benefit of experience. So you start to get just a little bit better at knowing when you need to be patient, like when you need to give an idea or a project a little more time. And so if you're in the position where you have a lot of experience, like you've been doing this or something like it for a long time and you feel like you can trust your instincts, that's great. But, if I'm speaking to people who are just getting started, who feel like they don't really have that experience to fall back on, I would say err on the side of, what I said before, don't let yourself get discouraged and confuse something that could be successful next month with something that happens to be like failing right now.
Yep. Good advice. It's like a few tweetables in there. So
cool. That's good.
Yeah. Thank you for those sound bites. Okay. So let's kind of talk about what does the world of monetizing content and sponsored content look like today? Because I know it's changed so much since you started in 2006. It's a whole new beast. So can you kind of give our listeners insight on kind of where we're at today, whether they're the ones who want to approach brands to get sponsored content on their website, or they're wanting to approach bloggers or their website so that they can advertise on their website?
Right. Sure. So it definitely works both ways. Bloggers need to understand what sponsors are trying to get out of the equation and vice versa. I won't go in too far into how things used to be. I don't know if it's really relevant because that was a long time ago. But, the way I think about how bloggers make money is in terms of influence, which is not a word that I actually love, this idea of like influencers and stuff. I certainly don't ever go to anybody and say like, my job is to be an influencer. It just doesn't feel really awesome. But
I knew it was a job title. Like you could put it, when you go to the doctor's office, they're like, what's your occupation? You're like, I'm an influencer.
Yeah. I don't think anybody likes to call them. Well, some people probably do, but I think most people don't. But I do think influence is how bloggers monetize. And so kind of the rubric that I, use to think about that is audience multiplied by engagement equals influence. So let me just make sure I have that right. Audience, which is, how many people you reach, multiplied by engagement, which is how much they care about what you're saying to them, equals influence. And influence is what you sell as a blogger. And there are a few different ways that you monetize influence or that you can monetize influence. And we can talk about those later. But that initial equation is kind of how I think about it. So, I use this example in my Alt Summit presentation, but, for example, one way of looking at that is to say, look at maybe my Facebook feed, right? Potentially there's a really big audience because there's a lot of people on Facebook. I might have a lot of followers, but for me particularly, my Facebook audience is not very engaged. The only person who likes my posts on Facebook is like my dad. So, I'll post something that I think is like really amazing and funny and cool. And, it gets like a couple likes. My dad will always like everything that I post.
I love dads.
So what that means is, I don't have a lot of influence. I'm just speaking about me, my personal account on Facebook. So I don't have a lot of influence. That's not something that I can really monetize. A different example is to think about, say, Oprah, right? So like Oprah, has a really big audience. She can reach a lot of people really quickly. But on top of that, the people that she reach really care about what she's saying, so she does have a lot of influence, and obviously she has monetized that to great effect. So as a blogger, your job is to kind of develop both sides of those equations, balance them in a way that makes sense for you and makes sense for the kind of business you want to run. Maybe you want to be, somebody with a really, really huge audience, but maybe not quite so much engagement. Or maybe you want to focus on a smaller audience that's really, really engaged. Either way, the end goal is to try to build up your influence so that you can monetize that.
Okay. So what's more valuable to a brand? Is it big audience with like an engagement, or like smaller audience but really high engagement?
Yeah, I think they're both valuable. I don't think anybody, wants a big, an audience with bad engagement. It's a question of relative engagement. The flip side of that is to say, would you want an audience of one that's extremely engaged? That's great, but it's still not that much influence, right? So it needs to be some balance. A brand does want a very engaged audience, but they also want to reach a lot of people. And so it can't just be one thing or the other. I will say that today, the needle is tipped more towards engagement, I think, than reach, than audience size. And it didn't always used to be that way. But for a variety of reasons, I think the benefit has kind of shifted towards people who have a slightly smaller but much more engaged audience than it used to be. And sponsored content has played into that. When brands do sponsored content, although they are still interested in reach and reaching a lot of people, the engagement piece, how did people actually interact with that content? What did it actually mean to them is more important than before.
And not to get super nerdy on this, but engagement, is there a certain type of engagement that's considered more quote unquote valuable, or is it just any type of interaction is considered to be valuable engagement?
I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think it depends a lot, for each brand. It depends on the brand and it depends on the product and the campaign. Some brands, when they do sponsored content, what they mean by engagement is that they want to see that when you mention a product that your readers want to buy that product. Like They click on it and they go and they look at it and maybe they buy it or they put it in their shopping cart. Other brands just want to generate conversation around, a particular marketing message or a product. So I think it depends. It depends on the campaign.
Okay. So let's say you're a blogger and you're starting to develop your audience, you're keeping kind of track of these metrics. Like at what point do you look at your numbers and say, okay, I think I'm at a point where I can now start reaching out to brands for sponsored content. And again, I realize that there's probably like not a magic number, but what are some things that people should be like looking into and saying, like, okay, these are the factors and it looks like I'm kind of on my way there? Because you talked about how sometimes failure and success initially they look the same. Do you have any kind of advice on that as if you're a new blogger and you want to start sponsoring content?
I don't know that there's a rule of thumb. I would say if you're getting 20 or 30,000 or 40,000 page views a month, I mean, like I said before, I sort of hate to fall back on some arbitrary number, but definitely if you're in that ballpark, you're pulling some traffic. You've got some people that are interested in what you're writing about. And I think you certainly should have no problem at least approaching some brands. So yeah, I mean, I think that would be like my really low baseline, that if you're in that range, in that ballpark, certainly if you're getting 50 or 100,000 page views a month, you have lots of chances to sell sponsored content. I think when it comes to social media, which is kind of where a lot more of the action is these days, if you're like looking at your Instagram account, 10,000, 20,000 followers, more than enough to try to start selling some sponsored Instagram posts. But again, it may vary. You may only have 5,000 followers, but the engagement on your post is extremely high. So you might still be able to swing it. I would just say it's never really too early to try. I mean, it doesn't hurt to pitch people. I'm always kind of an advocate of just hustling for it. So kind of no matter where you're at, the best time to start trying to do that, to hustle and to pitch and to sell is probably now.
Yeah.
Because that'll give you some feedback about, where you're at, wherever your audience size is. If you do the work to try to start pitching sponsors, trying to sell some ads or sell some sponsored content, you'll find out pretty quickly if you have enough audience or if you don't, if you have enough engagement or if you don't, because people will tell you.
Okay. And so what are some best practices if somebody is kind of new to this space and maybe they're feeling like, a little like imposter syndrome, like I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want to look like, I don't know what I'm doing. What are some best practices when you are approaching brands? Do you have any tips on that?
Yeah, man, imposter syndrome, just don't do that. Like you're just selling yourself short. Do you really think anybody, even people who've been doing it for a long time, don't feel that? I mean, I've been doing Curbly for 10 years. And when I approach a brand, I'm always like, should I really be like, are they really going to want to work with me? Like Target, really? So everybody has that. I don't know. I mean, so I just don't think, you got to just get that out of your head. Like you are worth it. You have every right to be here just like anybody else. So start with that. Start from the presumption that you deserve to be, on the playing field, just like anybody else. The second part of your question, some best practices, or I think, especially when it comes to sponsored content, it's really about developing relationships. So it helps to understand how sponsored content gets done. So in most cases, especially when you start talking about bigger brands, they have PR agencies, marketing agencies, ad agencies that are the intermediaries. And this may not be so much the case with smaller brands, but even with a smaller brand, there's going to be like a marketing manager or, somebody that you have to go through. And so it's really about developing relationships with those people. So how do you do that? Like, let's say you're a blog about parenting or something, and you've identified some brand that you want to work with. You've done some research. You see that they are doing some sponsored content because you've seen them doing sponsored content on other blogs. And so what do? You have to first figure out like who is the intermediary that I need to talk to. So are they working through an agency? And if so, who's the person I need to talk to at that agency? And then once you figure out who that person is, try to build a relationship with them. So, write a really targeted, focused, well thought out, researched email explaining, who you are, why you think they should try to work with you, how you guys could work together. And actually, there was another session about alt that really got into this. I think it was Jenny Comenda and somebody else whose name I forget, but Jenny from Little Green Notebook. And they really broke down step by step how you would go about pitching somebody out of the blue. Mm-hmm. And they did a great job. So if I can find that link, I'll send it to you, Annette, and maybe you can post it for people.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes. That would be great.
Yeah, but the bottom line is you have to develop a relationship with somebody. I always think, I always say sponsored content is not like a product that you sell where somebody just comes down the shelf and picks out your blog and buys a thing and walks away. It's a relationship. It's a service that you're offering, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to build that relationship. So once you figure out who that person is, you have to convince them of why you are worth working with. You have to help them try to sell that idea to whoever they have to convince. So in most cases, they're going to have to take this idea of let's do a sponsored post on, so-and-so's blog. And they're going to have to convince their manager or they're going to have to convince the client. So as much as you can do the work to help them do that, the better, and that means give them some stats that they can bring, put together a presentation that they can copy and paste their logo into and show to their client. But, do the legwork because, like I said, you're offering them a service. And so the more that you can do that, the better.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think sometimes we forget that so much about business is relationship building because we live in this online world and we don't have that benefit of, that face-to-face interaction. So it's just this blind kind of, you're sending out emails, right? And you forget that there's a person on the other side who has a job, who has, convincing to do to their client and, has a lot of things on their plate. So I think that's a great reminder that you want to build that relationship, but also make it easy for them. Make it easy.
Sometimes I think when I used to work in PR, we always used to say do their work for them, because everybody's busy and they've got a lot of clients. So to the extent that you can help do a little bit of their work for them, that's going to help you get in the door.
Yeah. Yeah. So earlier you talked about there are different ways in which you can monetize your influence. And we touched upon a few of them. You could do sponsored blog posts, there's social media posts. Are there any other things that you're seeing kind of working for people or starting to develop that people can start considering as they're trying to reach out to brands, or maybe they're a brand reaching out to a blogger, different ways to get sponsored content out there?
Yeah, so we look at monetizing influence and there's maybe 3 or 4 different ways to do it. The traditional way was to sell advertising, so banner ads. And Curbly did that and still does that for a long time. It was a really effective way of monetizing, earlier on in the history of the web. It was also a pretty effective way for brands to get their message out for a long time. I would say that display advertising is sort of in decline right now. And so if you're a new blogger starting out, it probably isn't a great place to spend your energy. So the second one is sponsored content, which we just talked a little bit about. After that is affiliate links, affiliate revenue, which is sort of as old as the internet is old, but has made a big resurgence in the last few years. And then after that is having a product. So all of those are different ways of taking your influence and trying to make money off of it. And, we try to do all of them. We succeed more at some than others. I think that definitely sponsored content is a really, it has a lot of potential for smaller bloggers because of what I said before, which is that the engagement matters a little bit more than the audience, than the reach does. And so if you're small, the fact that you're small might not matter as much when you're pitching a brand on sponsored content if you can show them that you have, an engaged audience. So specifically, what kinds of, you were asking what are the sort of new things happening in sponsored content? It started out with posts, just somebody would pay you and you would write a post that either was about their product or included their product. Now you're seeing a lot more just pure sponsored social media. Instagram, like I said before, is really big. A lot of brands wanting to be on Instagram, but also Facebook and especially live. So Facebook Live or Instagram Stories or Instagram Live. all those sort of new distribution channels for content are understandably getting utilized for sponsored as well. So another interesting one is events. I've seen a lot of brands wanting to do events with bloggers where they'll have a blogger come to an event or host an event or, a meetup or something like that. I think there's something both brands and bloggers like about getting people together in person. So that's something that I'm seeing more of too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the whole time you're talking about this, I'm like, I hope people are disclosing their affiliate relationship when they're talking about all this stuff. And just as, a side note, and I could probably do another episode on this, is just about, disclosing anytime you're being you are being compensated or it's sponsored or it's advertising, you're supposed to disclose that in a clear and conspicuous way to your readers. So you can't bury it somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not just because you're supposed to, it's not just because it's an FTC rule, but it's part of upholding the relationship with your readers.
Yeah. Having integrity, right?
Yeah, it is. And also, I mean, I think that part of it is not being ashamed about doing sponsored content. I mean, there's sometimes there's this feeling that there's something wrong or sleazy about it, but I don't really see it that way. I mean, if you create content for a living, that it costs money, right? It takes time. It takes money to buy the supplies that we use to create these blog posts, office space, internet, all kinds of things. So the content that people consume and love is not free. It costs money to make. And sponsored content is a way of paying for it. And it's not a bad way, actually, if it's done right. If it's done right, if it's disclosed, if it's well thought out content that's relevant, if you, take the brand's product or their messaging and you really work hard to put it in a context that is interesting, useful, educational for your readers, then that's a pretty good bargain. The readers are getting some more content for free that hopefully is, interesting and awesome. And you, the blogger, is getting paid, which is great because then you can keep the lights on. And the brand is getting to hopefully engage with some readers that they want to talk to.
Yeah. And I never really appreciated how much effort goes into creating consistent content, quality content, until I started the podcast. But, it takes a lot of resources to produce a show, just one episode, between my time, between the guest's time, between all the stuff that happens at the back end. You start really thinking about it in terms of, well, I'm investing both money and time into a show, kind of thinking of it from that business perspective, what's that return for me? And I could totally see how people would want to have a sponsor for a show to pay for some of that stuff, right? It's not even just to profit off of it, but just to cover those expenses. So I totally appreciate now being on that end of things, just what goes into it.
I think readers and listeners do too. And that's why, when you mentioned disclosure, that's another reason why, you don't need to hide it. You don't need to try to pass off a sponsored post as not sponsored. I think it's great to just be upfront about it. I've seen a lot of really great sponsorship disclosures that just say, hey, this is a brand that we like and we're working with them. Thank you guys for supporting our blog. Thank you to this brand for helping us pay for all the other content that we do that's not sponsored, of which there's a lot. So yeah, I think readers get it. And kind of going back to your question about approaching sponsors get it, so with this imposter syndrome idea, sponsors understand that the thing that you're offering them has value and takes time and money to make. So they get that costs money, that it makes sense to pay for it.
Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. And so it got me thinking about contracts. How many of the brands that you work with actually will offer up a contract for a sponsored ad or post or whatever? And I guess it might vary. If it's a bigger brand, they probably have a legal team that wants all of this stuff, written down. But where do you kind of see people, how do you see people dealing with this when it comes to actually documenting this agreement in writing? Is it something that the brand offers up? Is it something that the content producer offers up?
I would say probably 50% of the time the brand has a contract that they like to use. And it is definitely much more like 100% of the time when it's a big brand, think of like, a big nationally known brand, and less of a percentage when it's sort of more like a mom and a pop or like an online retailer or something like that. But we have our own sort of standard contract sponsorship agreement that we use. And I really think it's important for all bloggers to have one, whether or not you end up using yours. I think it's really good to have a framework that you are starting from. And even with brands even with a big brand, I won't like use a name that I know they're going to have their own contract, I'll still send them ours to start with. So when we're going back and forth and pitching, I'll still send them a pitch and be like, hey, by the way, so, here's our pitch. By the way, our contract is attached. If you guys, have your own contract you'd rather use, that's cool. Just send it over and we'll look at it.
Why do you do that?
I think it gives them a much higher level of comfort that they're working with a professional.
Yes.
So they're like, okay, they're coming to me. They have their ducks in a row. They have this contract. Most likely your contract is not going to work, for IKEA or somebody like that, right? It's just not going to fly. They've got a team of lawyers that will just shoot it down. But
it's Army probably.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it really shows professionalism. It shows that you are treating this, seriously as a business transaction.
Yeah.
You're going to follow through on what you say you're going to do. And to some extent, it also does set the playing field for the negotiation in terms of things like exclusivity, which almost all contracts will have some mention of, certainly in terms of the compensation and some of the other parameters around, how this thing is going to go. Again, even if you end up using something different, at least you're setting sort of like some very broad parameters about how you think about it.
I love that you said that, because it's one of the reasons why I say people should have contracts in their business, regardless of if it's a service agreement or it's, a sponsored content type of ad agreement, whatever it is. Because of that, one of the points is because it just communicates that you're a professional. So I'm so glad that you said it. I did not plant that question, but it's true, especially when you start working with bigger brands. You have to assess who your audience is. And in that situation, that audience is going to be, there's a lawyer on the other side. And if you have a contract and a professional contract, you're communicating, hey, I know what I'm getting into. I'm not just doing a sponsored content post because, I don't know, I need some extra money to go to Anthropologie and buy some clothes for myself or whatever, right?
Yeah.
They're really starting, they take you seriously. So I'm so glad to hear that that's what you do. Yeah.
A brand is never going to be like, oh, never mind. No, we don't want to work with them. They sent us a contract. That's never going to happen. That's not how they think. I also think it goes back to what we talked about before about building relationships. Again, if you're dealing, Anthropologie is maybe an example. If you're dealing with their PR firm, which you likely would be, not with them directly, they're going to then have to go to their client or their, contact at Anthropologie and communicate that they want to do this post with you. And so having this document that shows exactly what you plan to do and when and how much it's going to cost and exactly how many blog posts you're going to do and how many Instagrams and whatever, that makes the job of that account rep at the PR agency way easier, because otherwise they have to put that all together and they have to write that email and do the outline. And so you just saved them 20 minutes, out of their day.
Yeah. So with all of that said, I have two more questions for you, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot with this one. The first one, I want to know what your favorite IKEA hack is, because I know you guys talk a lot about that on the blog.
Oh, man. My favorite IKEA hack. Well,
I'm totally putting you on the spot.
There's just a lot of them. Let's see. So we did an IKEA hack years ago where we stencil. They have this, I don't know the name of it. They have this wooden kitchen. God, what is it called? It's like this island thing.
Yeah.
It's this shelving unit.
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
So we stenciled it. We stenciled this really pretty floral design on it. We lacquered it. And then we used it on our porch as sort of an entryway table.
Oh,
so
nice.
That was the one that I really liked. I'm trying to think of the other ones that I've liked. I'm actually literally looking at our IKEA hacks.
I'm going to link it up in the show notes because I know you guys have quite a few on those. But I love IKEA, man. I'm always amazed.
Say probably the other one, and this is the other one that comes to mind, is the Billy built-in bookshelf.
Yeah.
That's a funny one. I don't know if you guys have seen that one, but the Billy is their most basic, cheapest bookshelf. And I've seen people take it and turn it into this amazing looking, like really custom looking built-in bookshelf system. And that's probably the one, and actually I haven't done that one, obviously. So that's probably the one I would most want to do next, because I have this one spot in our house that is kind of an empty wall that I would love to have a big bookshelf on.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like when I Googled IKEA hacks and things, like just how your imagination can go wild. And I think there was a website, and I think they were somewhere in Europe, where you could buy like these really beautiful legs for the different, bookshelves and the different dressers, or like really nice handles. Like they were very like custom, kind of specifically made for IKEA products.
Yeah. There's one called Pretty Pegs. I think that might be the one you're thinking of.
Maybe, but it just elevates it, it just makes it look so designer and different. And my husband always hates it when I go to IKEA, because he knows we're going to come back and I'm going to want something, and he's going to have to haul it up the stairs and help me put it together.
I'll put a plug in for another, because there's a company called Semi Handmade based out of Portland, I think, and they do custom cabinetry doors. So what they do is you go to IKEA and you order cabinetry like for your kitchen. So you order a whole system, and then Semi Handmade makes these really beautiful door faces that go on top instead of using the stock ones that come from IKEA. So that's a pretty cool idea too.
Cool. We'll link them up in the show notes as well. Thank you for that. I'm going to totally spend the afternoon looking at that. Okay, so the final question is the one I ask all of my guests, which is the one thing I know for sure is, and I ask you to fill in the blank.
The one thing I know, that is a hard question to fill in on the spot. The one thing I know for sure is that, oh man, this might sound stupid, is that my family matters to me more than anything else. But I mean, it's true. That's kind of guided all of my decisions in terms of career, since I started. I mean, part of the reason for starting Curbly was because I didn't want a job where I didn't have control over my own time. That's a double negative. What I meant was I wanted a job where
I totally get it.
I could control my time. I mean, so I have two kids, a 4 and an 8-year-old. And what matters to me is being at pickup at school and drop off in the morning every day. Not some days, not every once in a while, but I pick up my kids at school every day at 3:00 and we walk home. So that obviously there's compromises that come with that. It cuts out of my workday. I can't schedule meetings at 3:00, but definitely that fills in your blank of the one thing I know for sure is that is a higher priority to me than any meeting or work thing that I could have at that time.
I love that. And it's funny because my dad always worked for himself. And he said, I could have gone and, worked and made all this, more money and done all of this stuff. But he goes, my greatest joy is when I got to come and pick you guys up from school. He's like, I still remember, he's like, Annette, you were all like frustrated. Your hair was a mess. You'd come in the back seat. And he goes, those are my greatest memories. And I know for me, that was very important as well, because that's how I was raised. And so much of this journey of leaving the law firm to start my own business has been to one day when I have kids is to be able to have that flexibility to do that as well. Because I think that's truly what matters at the end. So well said, Bruno.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Bruno. I really appreciate the insight that you've offered our listeners. And I'm definitely going to link up to Curbly and all the great resources you mentioned in the show notes so that readers, or actually listeners, can check out your website and become readers if they're not already.
Yeah, please. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, there you have it. I hope this episode inspired you to start thinking creatively about different ways that you can monetize your content moving forward. If you'd like to learn more about Bruno and Curbly, head on over to the show notes available at AnnetteStepanian.com/podcast/47. And you can always find him at Curbly.com. With that said, my friend, I hope you have a fantastic week, and I can't wait to talk to you later.